Good morning. Welcome you all. Today we will discuss Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is a vast literary time period. It stretches from the collapse of the Roman Empire in Britain to the beginning of the Renaissance. The period is subdivided into three parts: Anglo-Saxon literature, Anglo-Norman literature, and Middle English literature. The word medieval comes from the Latin medium and evo. There are two trends in scholarship concerning the Middle Ages. Some scholars viewed the Middle Ages as the beginning of ideas that continued developing well into the 16th century. Others feel that Middle Ages were created by 16th century writers who wanted to emphasize the originality of their contribution to literary culture. Old English was spoken by the Germanic invaders of Britain. Old French or Anglo-Norman was spoken in Britain after the Norman conquest of 1066. And Middle Ages or Middle English, which appeared in the 12th century, displaced French as Britain's official language by the end of the 14th century. Monasteries and other religious houses were the major producers of books until they were dissolved by King Henry VIII in the 1530s, at which point the king assured the nobility's loyalty to himself by giving them much of the former monastic houses, lands, and assets. Commercial book-making enterprises began around the 14th century. Religious houses were the major consumers of books during the Middle Ages. Nobles began purchasing and commissioning books during the Anglo-Norman period. Later, in the 14th century, wealthy urbanites also entered the book market. Anglo-Saxon literature. The Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes were the three related Germanic tribes who invaded the Roman province Britannia, that means England, around the year 450 after the Romans withdrew. The name English derives from the Angles. As the Germanic tribes invaded, native Britons withdrew from England to Wales, where the modern day versions of their language is still spoken. The widespread adoption of Christianity in the 7th century had an effect on literacy, as laws, histories, and ecclesiastic writings were propagated by the church. The Anglo-Saxons were invaded in turn by the Danes in the 9th century. Anglo-Saxons had a tradition of oral poetry, but only circumstantial evidence of this tradition remains in manuscripts. Most remaining Old English poetry is contained in just 4 manuscripts. Admiration for and performance of Germanic heroic poetry continued into the Christian era. Values of Anglo-Saxon heroic poetry include kingship relations rather than geography from the idea of a nation. Generosity is expected on the part of the Lord, from Old English words meaning protector and loaf, who leads men in war and rewards them with a share of the booty. On the part of the Lord's men, what is valued is loyalty until the Lord's death, and revenge killing or eternal shame if vengeance is not pursued after it. Old English poetry is often elegiac. It often combines Christian texts with Germanic heroic values. Old English poetry uses a special formal poetic vocabulary, including devices like synecdoche, metonymy, and kenning, a two-word compound in place of a more straightforward noun, and frequently employs irony. Anglo-Norman literature. The Normans took possession of England in 1066. The ruling class in England during this period spoke Old French. From four main languages circulated in England during the Anglo-Norman period: Old French or Anglo-Norman, Latin, Old English, and different branches of the Celtic language group. Anglo-Norman aristocrats loved the old Celtic oral tales sung by Breton storytellers. These tales were called Breton lays. Breton lays were developed by writers like Mary de France and Chrétien de Troyes into the form known as romance. Romance was the main narrative genre for late medieval readers. A chivalric romance focuses on knightly adventures, knightly love for and courtesy toward ladies, and the display of martial prowess against powerful, sometimes supernatural foes. The most famous example of knightly chivalry was the legendary court of King Arthur. Romances in which a knight must prove his worthiness through bravery and noble deeds can reflect the social aspirations of members of the lower nobility to rise socially. French sources and writers were influential. However, works like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and early Middle English religious prose texts for women such as AngloNorman show the continued development of the English language during this period. Middle English literature in the 14th and 15th centuries. English gained ground gradually as Britain's main language. By 1200, poetry and prose were being written in English for educated readers, and many readers were French-English bilingual. By the end of the 13th century, merchant class and noble children learned French as their second language. In 1348, the bubonic plague or Black Death destroyed 1/4 to 1/3 of the population of Europe. The scarcity of laborers following the plague gave laborers some power and possibility of social mobility. The Lollards were one such group. There were the followers of social reformer John Wycliffe. William Langland's poem Piers Plowman investigates the social potential of this movement. Langland's poem is part of the alliterative revival, a 14th century style of poetry writing that uses earlier Anglo-Saxon versification practices. The 14th century saw the expansion of the merchant class and international trade, trends visible in Geoffrey Chaucer's career as a civil servant and in his portrait of the merchant in the Canterbury Tales. A new canon of literary giants comparable to the ancients in status emerged in the 14th century. These included Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch. While Chaucer and Langland's works exist in several copies, the work of the poet who wrote Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and three other poems exists only in a single copy. The 15th century saw the production of mystery plays or cycles of plays that dramatized Bible stories by city guilds, which were organizations representing trades. The morality play, in which personified virtues and vices struggled for man's soul, was also popular in the 15th century. Productions of morality plays by professional players served as the forerunner of early modern professional theatre of Elizabeth I. Sir Thomas Malory's 15th century English translation and retelling of 13th century French romances about King Arthur, Morte d'Arthur, renewed the popularity of tales of the Knights of the Round Table in their quest for the Holy Grail. In 1476, William Caxton introduced movable type to England, thereby drastically increasing the speed at which books could be made in multiple copy and dispersed to readers, as well as decreasing the cost of production. One of Caxton's first successes was a print edition of Malory's Morte d'Arthur. Medieval English. Old English, which has an almost entirely Germanic vocabulary, is a heavily inflected language. Its words change form to indicate changes in function such as person, number, tense, case, mood, and so forth. The introduction in the anthology gives detailed rules for pronouncing Middle English. In general, sound allowed all consonants except Sound allowed the final Sound double vowels as long, and pronounce short vowels as in modern English, and long vowels as in modern European languages other than English. Old and Middle English prosody. The verse form of all Old English poetry is the same. The verse unit is the single line. Rhyme is not often used to link lines in Old English. Alliteration, or beginning several words with the same sound, is the organizing principle of Old English poetry. A consonant alliterates with its mate or with another consonant that makes the same sound. A vowel alliterates with any other vowel. An Old English alliterative line contains four principal stresses and is divided by a caesura, a pause, into two half lines, each containing two stresses. At least one of the stressed words in the first half line begins with the same sound as the first stressed word of the second half line. The last stressed word often is non-alliterative. Middle English verse can be alliterative, as above, through sometimes increasing the number of alliterative or stressed words, or influenced by Old French. It can be in the form of alternative stressed rhyming verse lines. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales are mainly in rhymed couplets with five stress lines.